3 weeks after my husband ended our 30-year marriage, I used the last $21,000 I had to take over the lease of a closed-down restaurant no one else wanted. The place had been empty for years. The fridge barely worked. The floors were cracked. I remember thinking I had just bought myself a slow, quiet failure. But on my second day, I opened a storage room in the back that hadn't been touched in years. Inside were wooden crates covered in dust. 30 bottles, each sealed in wax, each labeled with my grandmother's name, the same grandmother who passed away nearly 30 years ago. I stood there, holding one, confused about how it ended up there, until I found the old invoices underneath. That's when I realized these bottles weren't just forgotten inventory. They were something my husband never knew existed, and the beginning of the one thing he would later regret walking away from. I hadn't planned to explore the back of the restaurant that morning. I had come with a measuring tape, a notebook, and a quiet sense of urgency because every decision now carried weight. The place smelled like old grease and dust, and the silence inside felt heavier than I expected, like the building itself had been waiting too long for someone to return. I moved slowly through the kitchen, writing down what could be repaired and what had to be replaced. The refrigerator hummed but barely cooled. The stove looked older than my marriage, and that thought caught me off guard because my marriage had ended just 3 weeks earlier, not with shouting or anger, but with calm paperwork slid across a kitchen table. 30 years reduced to signatures and polite explanations. He told me we had grown apart, that he wanted something different, and by the time my lawyer reviewed the documents, I realized most of what we had built legally belonged to him. Accounts had been moved years earlier, the house refinanced into his name, and the business structured so my work never officially existed. I still remembered sitting in that lawyer's office feeling embarrassed more than angry, embarrassed that I had trusted someone for 3 decades and never asked enough questions. The $21,000 settlement felt less like a fresh start and more like a quiet ending, which is why I took the first realistic opportunity I found, a distress lease for an old soul food restaurant on Edgewood Avenue in Atlanta. The previous owner had moved into assisted living. The landlord wanted someone to take over operations, and the equipment came with the space. It wasn't ideal, but it was possible, and possible was all I needed. I continued through the kitchen, stepping around stacked chairs and old boxes, when I noticed the narrow door near the back wall, half hidden and easy to miss. I almost ignored it, because I didn't have time for distractions, but something about the way it was tucked behind everything made me pause. I moved the chairs aside and turned the handle slowly. The hinges creaked softly, and a thin line of light stretched across the dusty floor. Inside the room smelled like old paper and wood. Broken equipment leaned against the walls, cardboard boxes softened with age, and against the far wall were wooden crates covered in canvas. I told myself it was probably old inventory or useless supplies, but I stepped forward anyway and pulled the canvas back. Underneath were bottles, neatly arranged, dust gathered evenly across the glass, each sealed carefully in wax. I picked one up without thinking and wiped the label gently with my sleeve. Carter's Kitchen Reserve, Evelyn Carter, New Orleans, Louisiana, and my breath caught before I understood why. Evelyn Carter was my grandmother. I hadn't seen her name printed like that in nearly 30 years. She had bottled small batch hot sauce for neighbors and local restaurants. Nothing large, just something she built quietly from her kitchen. When she passed away, I assumed everything had disappeared. I turned the bottle slowly in my hand, noticing the careful labeling, the consistent design, the wax seals still intact, and suddenly I realized these weren't random leftovers. Someone had ordered these, someone had stored them carefully, and someone had never come back for them. I searched the crate again and noticed a thin folder tucked beneath the bottles, the paper inside yellowed but intact. Invoices, handwritten notes, small monthly orders dated nearly 15 years earlier. The restaurant had been buying from my grandmother regularly, and I stood there in that dusty storage room holding proof that something my grandmother built had lasted longer than I ever knew, longer than my marriage, longer than everything I thought I had lost. And for the first time since signing the divorce papers, I felt something shift quietly inside me, because this wasn't just inventory. This was history. This was something real, something that existed long before my husband built his life and long before he walked away from mine. And standing there with that bottle in my hand, I realized something that made my chest tighten in a different way. If this forgotten room still held something my grandmother created, then maybe my life hadn't been reduced to nothing after all. And as I carefully placed the bottle back into the crate, I found myself wondering something I hadn't allowed myself to think since the divorce. What if starting over didn't mean building from nothing? What if it meant rediscovering something that had been quietly waiting for me all along? And if you had just lost everything, then found a piece of your past sitting quietly in a dusty room, would you see coincidence or the beginning of something you never expected? I didn't rush to celebrate what I had found because I had learned recently how dangerous assumptions can be. Instead, I sat on an overturned crate in that dusty storage room and looked through the folder more carefully. The invoices were small but consistent, handwritten monthly orders stretching across several years, and beneath them were short notes between my grandmother and the restaurant owner discussing pepper sourcing, batch sizes, and small flavor adjustments. The handwriting unmistakably hers, neat and deliberate, the same handwriting I remembered from her recipe notebook sitting on her kitchen counter when I was a child. And suddenly, I remembered her mentioning once, years before she passed, that she was sending bottles to a place in Atlanta, but I never asked where, because at the time, my life had been moving forward. Marriage, children, my husband's growing business, and like most things we assume will always be there, I thought I would ask her someday. I took photos of the bottles, the labels, and the paperwork, then carefully carried the folder back to the front counter. My thoughts moving slower but steadier than they had since the divorce. That afternoon, I searched her name online, not expecting much, but a few old results appeared. An archived restaurant menu listing Evelyn Carter House hot sauce, a small food blog mentioning a Louisiana-style small batch sauce that chefs used years ago, and an old comment thread asking if it was still available. None of it meant immediate value, but it told me something important. My grandmother hadn't just made sauce casually. She had built something small but real. 2 days later, I met with a small business attorney named Karen Whitfield. I explained everything and laid the folder on her desk. She reviewed the documents slowly, asking questions about my grandmother, about heirs, about whether anyone else had continued production. Then she leaned back slightly and explained that while the brand had never been federally registered, the consistent invoices and handwritten documentation suggested clear commercial use, and as her direct heir, I likely held the rights to the name and recipe, though we would still need to file paperwork to properly secure it. I nodded quietly, not because I believed I had found something valuable yet, but because for the first time since losing everything, I realized I had something that legally belonged to me, not shared, not negotiated, not signed away, mine. When I returned to the restaurant later that afternoon, I walked straight to the storage room again and lifted one of the bottles. The wax cracked softly as I opened it, and the smell hit me instantly. Cayenne, vinegar, and something warm underneath that I remembered from childhood mornings in my grandmother's kitchen. Vinegar-based sauces hold well over time, especially when sealed properly. And when I tasted a small drop, the flavor was still there. Not memory, not nostalgia, real. Over the next few days, I recreated small batches using her handwritten notes, adjusting carefully for modern equipment and documenting everything the way she had. I didn't rush into selling anything. Instead, I focused on opening the restaurant first. Simple menu, limited hours, manageable costs. The hot sauce became a quiet addition, small bottles placed on tables without explanation. The first weekend after opening, a man in his 50s called me over and asked where the sauce came from. I told him it was my grandmother's recipe, and he nodded slowly and said it tasted like something he remembered from New Orleans years ago. That same conversation happened again 2 days later, then again the following weekend. Nothing dramatic, just quiet curiosity building naturally. And for the first time since my life had been reduced to paperwork and empty rooms, I felt something return. Not confidence exactly, but possibility. And standing there in that small kitchen watching customers reach for those bottles, I found myself wondering something I hadn't allowed myself to think in weeks. What if starting over didn't mean rebuilding from nothing? What if it meant rediscovering something that had been waiting quietly for me all along? And if you were standing where I was, holding something from your past that still worked after all these years, would you see risk? Or would you take the chance and build something new from it? I didn't tell anyone about the sauce at first. I just kept working quietly because I had learned that small, steady progress mattered more than big announcements. The restaurant opened with limited hours, a short menu, and only 2 employees. I kept costs low and expectations lower. The sauce stayed on the tables in small glass bottles with simple labels. No marketing, no signs, just something for people to try. The first few weeks were slow but steady. Customers returned. Some asked if they could buy bottles to take home, so I started bottling small batches in the evenings after closing, documenting everything carefully, the way my grandmother had. One afternoon, a local food blogger stopped by. She didn't announce herself, just ordered lunch and later asked about the sauce. 2 days later, she posted a short article mentioning the restaurant and specifically the small batch hot sauce with a quiet story behind it. That weekend, we sold out of every bottle I had prepared. Nothing dramatic, just a steady shift, the kind that happens quietly before you realize things are changing. I expanded carefully, never producing more than I could manage, never moving faster than I could control. About 3 months after opening, I was wiping down the counter when the door opened and I saw Calvin walk in. I recognized him immediately, even though I hadn't seen him since the divorce. He paused near the entrance, looking around at the full tables, the staff moving comfortably, the small bottles on each table, and for a moment he looked uncertain, like he hadn't expected to see something real. He approached slowly and said he had heard I was doing well, his tone calm, familiar, the same tone he used when he wanted something without saying it directly. He mentioned he had contacts who could help expand distribution, investors who might be interested, opportunities to scale quickly. I listened quietly, noticing how naturally he spoke about ownership and growth, the same language he used years earlier when decisions quietly removed my name from things we built together. When he finished, I thanked him politely and told him I was keeping things small for now. He nodded, but I could see the calculation behind his expression, the recognition that something he once dismissed had become valuable. He stayed a few minutes, then left without finishing his coffee. A few weeks later, I heard through a mutual friend that his firm had downsized after several deals fell through. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of slow shift that changes everything quietly. Meanwhile, the restaurant continued to grow. We bottled small batches, customers began asking for shipments, and I hung my grandmother's photograph near the kitchen entrance where I could see it every morning. One evening after closing, I stood alone in the quiet dining room, the smell of cayenne still in the air, and realized something heavier than revenge. Calvin had taken the house, the savings, and the future we thought we were building together, but he never noticed the things that didn't have his name on them. He never asked about my grandmother's recipes, never opened the old notebook, never understood where my confidence quietly came from. And standing there in a restaurant built from my last $21,000 and 30 forgotten bottles, I understood something even more clearly. He hadn't left me with nothing. He had left me with the one thing he never saw. And sometimes the quietest form of justice isn't watching someone fall, it's building something they never believed you could build without them. And if you had the chance to prove someone wrong, not with words, but with the life you quietly built afterward, would you tell them, or would you simply let them see it on their own?